The letter sat unfinished on the small desk, ink still wet where Oliver Hazard Perry's hand had paused mid-sentence. September 9th, 1813. Midnight had come and gone, yet sleep remained as distant as the British fleet anchored somewhere in the darkness, beyond his cabin window. The single candle threw shadows across the cramped quarters of the USS Lawrence, making the walls seem to breathe with the ship's gentle rocking. Perry stared at the words he'd written, "My dearest Elizabeth," if you read this, and felt the weight of tomorrow pressing against his chest like a physical thing. He was 28 years old. In 12 hours, he would lead 400 men into the largest naval battle ever fought on the Great Lakes. The British squadron, commanded by Captain Robert Harriet Barclay, waited out there in the pre-dawn darkness. 6 warships crewed by veterans of Trafalgar, men who'd learned their trade fighting Napoleon's finest. Perry had built his fleet from trees that stood as living forests 6 months ago. His sailors included farmers who'd never seen deep water, freed slaves learning gunnery from scratch, Irish immigrants who barely spoke English, even former British prisoners who'd switched sides for a chance at prize money. The naval establishment in Washington had given him an impossible mission: construct a squadron in the wilderness, train crews from nothing, defeat the Royal Navy, save the Northwest Territory. Most officers would have considered it career suicide. Perry picked up the quill again, dipped it carefully. "I have commanded men to their deaths before, but never so many at once." The words looked stark on paper, too honest perhaps, but Elizabeth deserved truth. She was 7 months pregnant with their 3rd child, waiting in Rhode Island for news that might never come. Their daughter Elizabeth was 5 now, Jane only 3. Would they remember their father if he fell tomorrow? Would the child Elizabeth carried, boy or girl, he'd never know which, grow up hearing stories of a man who existed only in fading memory in official dispatches? The Lawrence creaked as wind shifted across Lake Erie's restless surface. Perry set down the quill and stood, pacing the 3 steps his cabin allowed. Through the stern windows, he could just make out the silhouettes of his other ships, dark shapes against darker water. The Niagara, nearly identical to Lawrence in size and armament. The smaller schooners and sloops that would support the 2 big brigs when battle came. Somewhere beyond them, British campfires glowed like fallen stars along the Canadian shore. Barclay's men were preparing too, checking guns and sharpening cutlasses, writing their own letters to wives and mothers they might never see again. Perry touched the miniature portrait he kept in his coat pocket. Elizabeth's face captured in careful brushstrokes, her expression serene and knowing. She'd understood when he accepted this command. The Perry family had given sons to the sea for 3 generations. His father, Captain Christopher Raymond Perry, had fought the French in the Quasi-War. His brother Matthew was already making a name for himself in the Navy. Service wasn't a choice in their family, it was inheritance, duty, the only path a Perry man could walk with honor. But duty had never felt this heavy before, this personal. Elizabeth would raise their children alone if he failed. Worse, she'd raise them in a country that might lose the Northwest Territory forever, that might be carved into pieces by British strategy and Native American alliance, that might never recover from the humiliation of defeat. The War of 1812 had been grinding on for over a year now, and the news was almost uniformly grim. Detroit had fallen in August 1812 when General William Hull surrendered his entire army without firing a shot. 2,500 men marched into captivity while the British flag rose over American soil. The disaster had sent shockwaves through the young republic. If regular army forces with superior numbers couldn't hold the frontier, what hope did scattered settlements have against British-armed Native American warriors and Canadian militia? The British strategy was elegant and devastating. Control the Great Lakes, control the region. Their naval squadrons patrolled at will, transporting troops and supplies, while American forces watched helplessly from shore. Every major port was either captured or blockaded. The Royal Navy's dominance seemed absolute. Then in February 1813, the Navy Department made its bold gamble. They would challenge British supremacy on the lakes themselves. The problem was immediate and overwhelming. They had virtually no fleet on the Great Lakes, no experienced crews familiar with freshwater sailing, no infrastructure for building warships hundreds of miles from the nearest ocean port. That's when Secretary of the Navy William Jones sent his orders to Perry. Report to Presque Isle, Pennsylvania. Build a squadron. Defeat the British. The survival of the Northwest Territory depends upon your success. Perry had arrived at Presque Isle in March to find Master Shipwright Noah Brown already at work performing what seemed like frontier magic. The sound of axes echoed through the Pennsylvania forests as trees older than the Republic itself fell to saws and determination. Brown had established a complete shipyard in the wilderness. Sawmills, forges, workshops, all carved from nothing in a landscape that seemed designed to resist such ambition. Local farmers provided oxen and horses for hauling materials through roads that were barely more than widened game trails. Canvas for sails came from Philadelphia, 200 miles over mountain passes that turned to impassable mud with every rain. Iron for cannons traveled from Pittsburgh foundries, each piece carried by ox cart at agonizing pace. Cordage, rigging materials, hardware, tools, every item had to be transported through country that tested the limits of what logistics could accomplish. Perry had watched Brown work with something approaching awe. The man was in his 40s, built like a barrel, with hands scarred by decades of maritime construction. He'd built ships in New York yards for 20 years before the Navy Department recruited him for this wilderness project. Brown didn't waste words. When Perry asked if the timeline was possible, 6 warships by summer, Brown had simply nodded and returned to directing the organized chaos of his forest shipyard. The man worked 18-hour days, personally supervising every critical joint in timber selection, teaching local carpenters the specific requirements of warship construction. Merchant ships could tolerate rough work. Warships needed precision or men died. The flagship would be named Lawrence, after Perry's friend Captain James Lawrence, who'd commanded the USS Chesapeake in her fatal duel with HMS Shannon that June. Perry had known James since they were midshipmen together, had served alongside him in the Mediterranean during the Barbary Wars. They'd shared watches and stories, ambitions and fears, the kind of friendship that military service forged between men who understood what it meant to face death as part of their profession. When news reached Perry that the Chesapeake had been captured and James mortally wounded, something had shifted in his chest. The official report included James's dying words, spoken as blood pooled on the Chesapeake's deck, and his crew wavered under British boarding parties. "Don't give up the ship." Those words became an obsession. Perry had ordered a battle flag sewn, blue fabric with white letters spelling out what James had said. "Don't give up the ship," no apostrophe. The letters stark and uncompromising. The flag would fly from Lawrence's main mast when battle came. Every man in Perry's squadron would see those words and understand what they meant. Surrender was not an option. Defeat was not acceptable. They would fight until the ships sank beneath them or the enemy struck their colors. It was a promise Perry made to his dead friend, to his country, to himself. James Lawrence had died trying to keep his ship from capture. Perry would honor that death by refusing to fail. The Lawrence took shape through spring and early summer, 110 feet long with 20 guns. But those weren't the long-range cannons that formed the backbone of traditional naval firepower. Perry's main armament consisted of 32-pound carronades, short, squat guns that fired devastating shot at close range, but were nearly useless beyond 400 yards. The decision reflected both practical necessity and tactical calculation. Long-range cannons were scarce and heavy, difficult to transport through wilderness. Carronades were more available and lighter, easier to move and mount, but they forced a specific tactical approach. Perry would have to close distance quickly, absorbing punishment from British long-range guns until his squadron got near enough to unleash the carronade's brutal firepower. It was an inherently risky strategy that demanded precise timing, perfect coordination, and nerves of steel from every man who sailed into battle. The second large vessel, Niagara, was nearly identical to Lawrence, another 20-gun brig designed for close-quarters devastation. Together, these two ships would carry the heaviest weight of metal in Perry's squadron. But Perry also had smaller vessels, the schooners Ariel, Scorpion, Summers, Porcupine, and Tigress, plus the sloops Trippy and Caledonia. 9 ships total, a respectable squadron on paper, but only if Perry could find crews to sail them, and only if those crews could learn their jobs before the British came hunting. Finding sailors proved as difficult as building the ships. The regular Navy could spare few experienced men. Most available sailors were already assigned to ocean-going vessels blockading British ports or protecting American merchantmen from the Royal Navy's frigates. Perry ended up recruiting locally, taking anyone willing to sign articles and learn the trade. His crew roster became one of the most diverse in American naval history. Regular Navy men formed the core, maybe 100 experienced sailors who knew their way around guns and rigging. Local volunteers added another 200, mostly farmers and tradesmen from Pennsylvania and Ohio, who'd never spent more than a day on the water. Then came the freed African Americans, men who saw military service as both patriotic duty and chance to prove their worth in a nation that still enslaved millions who looked like them. Recent immigrants added language complexity, Irish and Germans and Dutch speakers who had to learn English commands while simultaneously mastering seamanship. Even more controversially, Perry accepted former British prisoners of war who'd agreed to switch sides, men captured in earlier engagements who preferred fighting under American colors to rotting in prison camps. This mixing of races and nationalities was unusual enough to draw comment from Perry's superiors. One letter from the Navy Department expressed concern about crew cohesion, wondering if such diversity might create discipline problems or weaken fighting spirit. Perry's response was characteristically pragmatic. I have no choice but to accept the men available. We shall make sailors of them or fail in the attempt. I will not refuse any man willing to fight for his country. Regardless of his birth or color, training the disparate crew required innovation and patience. Perry established camps where men practiced gunnery until they could load and fire in their sleep. Language barriers were overcome through demonstration and repetition. Gun captains showed rather than explained, using hand signals and physical guidance until every man in each crew understood his role. Sail handling was drilled endlessly, men climbing rat lines, setting and furling canvas, learning to coordinate their efforts so the ship responded as a single organism to the captain's will. Damage control techniques became routine, plugging shot holes with oakum and canvas, splicing broken rigging, improvising repairs while under fire. Perry knew his crews lacked the battle experience that made British sailors so formidable. But muscle memory and automatic responses could be developed through relentless practice. When cannonballs started flying and men started dying, the sailors who survived would be those whose hands knew what to do, even when their minds froze with fear. While Perry built and trained, the British weren't idle. Captain Robert Harriet Barclay commanded their Lake Erie squadron from his flagship HMS Detroit, a powerful 19-gun ship that outgunned anything the Americans were constructing. Barclay was a formidable opponent, born in Scotland in 1786, commissioned into the Royal Navy as a young midshipman. His defining experience came at Trafalgar in October 1805, where he'd served aboard HMS Swiftsure during Admiral Nelson's crushing victory over the combined French and Spanish fleets. Barclay lost his left arm to French gunfire that day, a wound that ended many naval careers but somehow enhanced his reputation. A one-armed captain who'd fought at Trafalgar carried enormous prestige. The loss proved his courage under fire, marked him as a man who'd given flesh for king and country. When Barclay received orders to command on Lake Erie, he brought the confidence and tactical knowledge of a veteran who'd faced the best the French Navy could offer. Barclay's squadron included 6 vessels: his flagship Detroit, the ship Queen Charlotte, the brig General Hunter, the schooners Lady Provost and Chippewa, and the sloop Little Belt. While Perry had more hulls, Barclay's ships carried more long-range cannons, giving him significant advantages in firepower, range, and accuracy at distance. British gun crews were experienced, disciplined, drilled to the standard that had made the Royal Navy master of the world's oceans. Barclay's strategy seemed fundamentally sound: maintain long-range bombardment, use superior gunnery to cripple American ships before they closed to effective carronade range, destroy Perry's squadron piece by piece while staying beyond the reach of those devastating short-range guns. The British controlled the eastern end of Lake Erie from their base at Amherstburg near Detroit. Their supply lines were established, their crews were veteran, they held every tactical advantage that experience and infrastructure could provide. All Barclay had to do was prevent the Americans from breaking out of Prescott Bay, and the status quo would continue indefinitely. The bay was protected by a sandbar that created a natural trap. Perry's larger vessels, once launched, couldn't cross the bar fully loaded with guns, supplies, and men. The depth was only 5 to 6 feet over the sandbar. Lawrence and Niagara needed 9 feet of draft when fully equipped for battle. Barclay knew this vulnerability and positioned ships to attack the moment any American vessel tried to leave. Perry faced an impossible tactical puzzle: leave the ships in the bay where they were useless, or try to cross the sandbar where British guns would destroy them at their most vulnerable moment. Perry spent weeks studying the problem, observing weather patterns and British patrol schedules, calculating risks and alternatives. The solution he devised was part engineering, part psychology, part pure audacity. On August 4th, 1813, he made his move. Instead of trying to sneak the fleet out under cover of darkness, Perry turned the operation into a calculated display of force. He positioned his armed smaller vessels to cover the sandbar crossing, creating a defensive screen that would force any British attack to come within range of American guns. Then he began the delicate process of lightening his larger ships to float them across the shallow bar. The operation was complex and dangerous. Every gun had to be removed from Lawrence and Niagara, ferried across the bar separately on small boats, then remounted on the other side. Supplies were transferred to smaller vessels that could cross fully loaded. The big ships were literally floated empty across the sandbar, riding high in the water with minimal draft, then reloaded piece by piece under potential enemy observation. The entire process took hours, every moment of which left Perry's fleet vulnerable to attack. If the British chose to strike while the big ships were being pulled across, stripped of armament and unable to maneuver effectively, they could destroy the American squadron before it ever entered the lake proper. The British appeared on schedule, just as Perry anticipated. Captain Robert Finnis, commanding the British advance squadron, found himself facing a tactical puzzle he hadn't expected. Perry had positioned his forces with careful deliberation, creating a situation where any attack on the vulnerable big ships would require engaging the American defensive screen at close range. Finnis could see Lawrence and Niagara being hauled across the bar, stripped of guns, perfect targets. But reaching them meant sailing past American schooners and sloops specifically positioned for close quarters fighting, vessels armed with the same kind of carronades that made short-range combat so devastating. British naval doctrine emphasized maintaining long-range advantages whenever possible. Closing to point-blank range with purpose-built American gunboats violated every principle of sound tactics. The risk-reward calculation didn't favor aggression. Finnis chose caution and withdrew, allowing Perry to complete his crossing operation unmolested. It was Perry's first psychological victory. He'd successfully bluffed his way out of an impossible situation using tactical positioning and implicit threat. The British assumption of naval superiority worked against them. Finnis couldn't believe the Americans would deliberately create such vulnerability unless it concealed some trap or advantage he couldn't perceive. So he waited, and in waiting, allowed Perry's fleet to escape into open water. By mid-August, Perry's squadron was free on Lake Erie, and freedom brought the urgent need for final preparation. He drilled his crews relentlessly in every aspect of naval warfare. Gun crews practiced loading and firing until their hands bled and their shoulders bruised from recoil, until they could service their cannons blind and half asleep, until the mechanical routine of load aim, fire swab reload became as natural as breathing. Signal procedures were rehearsed until every man knew his role in fleet maneuvers, until Perry could order complex tactical shifts with a few flag combinations and trust that every ship would respond correctly. Damage control techniques were drilled repeatedly because battle always created chaos. Rigging shot away, sails torn, hulls holed below the waterline, fires started by flaming wadding. The crews that survived were those who could improvise repairs under fire, who could patch a hull while cannonballs crashed overhead, who could splice broken lines with steady hands despite blood and smoke and screaming. Perry also had to solve his fundamental strategic problem. His fleet was designed for close-range fighting. Most of his guns were carronades that hit with tremendous force, but couldn't reach far. The British had more long-range cannons that could pound American ships before they got close enough to fight back effectively. This meant Perry would have to close distance quickly, absorbing brutal punishment until he could bring his devastating short-range firepower to bear. It was a strategy that demanded precise timing, perfect coordination, and unflinching courage from crews who'd have to sail through a storm of iron while unable to effectively return fire. Every mistake in timing or positioning would be paid for in blood. Every hesitation would extend the period of vulnerability. Success required every ship in his squadron to execute maneuvers flawlessly while under fire, in conditions that tested the limits of human endurance and nerve. The tactical challenge was compounded by Lake Erie's notorious weather. The lake's shallow waters and surrounding terrain created unpredictable wind patterns that could leave sailing ships becalmed or drive them off course at crucial moments. Perry couldn't count on steady wind conditions during battle. He had to plan for multiple contingencies: light winds that would slow his advance, variable winds that might scatter his formation, sudden gusts that could dismast damaged ships. Traditional naval tactics assumed certain environmental constants. Lake Erie offered no such certainty. Meanwhile, British supplies were running dangerously short. Captain Barclay's position was becoming desperate despite his apparent tactical advantages. His ships needed provisions that could only come across Lake Erie, but he couldn't safely transport them while Perry's squadron was lurking somewhere on the water. The British garrison at Detroit was literally running out of food. Native American allies, crucial to British strategy in the Northwest Territory, were becoming restless as promised supplies failed to arrive. The very success of British control strategy was creating logistical problems that threatened to undermine their entire position. Barclay could wait for more supplies and risk losing his Native American allies and starving the Detroit garrison, or he could come out and fight Perry's fleet despite being undermanned and under-equipped. Neither option was good, but doing nothing was worse. On September 9, 1813, Barclay made his fateful decision. He would come out and fight. His ships were undermanned, his supplies were inadequate, his strategic situation was deteriorating faster than his tactical position was improving. But he couldn't wait any longer. The entire British position in the Northwest Territory depended on maintaining naval superiority. If Barclay lost control of Lake Erie, the garrison at Detroit would starve. The Native American Confederation would collapse, and American forces would invade Canada unopposed. Everything hinged on the next battle. Perry's lookout spotted the British fleet at dawn on September 10th. 6 British ships against 9 American vessels, but the British ships were individually more powerful and carried more experienced crews. This would be a battle of tactics and determination, rather than simple numerical superiority. Perry immediately signaled for his fleet to form battle line and prepare for action. He raised his famous battle flag on Lawrence's main mast, that blue banner with white letters spelling out James Lawrence's dying words. "Don't give up the ship." Every man in the American fleet could see those words as they sailed toward destiny. Perry stood on Lawrence's quarterdeck, watching his squadron execute the maneuvers he'd drilled into them over long summer weeks. The morning was clear, wind-light and variable, conditions that would make closing with the enemy difficult but not impossible. The hours before battle carried their own peculiar tension. Men checked weapons and equipment with obsessive attention to detail, finding small tasks to occupy hands and minds while fear built in their chests. Some prayed quietly, others joked with forced humor. Still others simply stared at the approaching British ships with expressions that revealed nothing of the turmoil beneath. Perry walked among his crew, offering encouragement, checking readiness, projecting confidence he wasn't entirely certain he possessed. He saw young faces, boys really, some not yet 20, who would be dead in hours if the day went badly. He saw hardened veterans who'd seen battle before and knew what was coming. He saw freed black sailors like 19-year-old Hannibal Collins, men who'd volunteered to prove their worth and were about to pay for that proof in blood and terror. Hannibal Collins had joined Perry's fleet in July, a freed black man from Philadelphia whose father worked the docks and taught his son everything about sails and rigging. Hannibal's mother had died from fever when he was 15, and his father wanted better for his son than a docker's life. So when recruiters came looking for volunteers to man Perry's fleet, Hannibal stepped forward. His motivation was simple and profound: prove that black men could be heroes, prove that courage and capability weren't limited by race, earn respect through service. He'd been assigned to Lawrence, gun crew number 4, loading and firing one of the big 32-pound carronades that would hopefully decide the battle. His gun captain was a veteran named MacDougall, a Scotsman with 20 years in the Royal Navy before he'd deserted and made his way to America. MacDougall had steady hands and a calm voice, qualities that would matter desperately when the metal started flying. The wind conditions that morning favored British long-range artillery. Light, variable breezes meant Perry's ships would have difficulty closing quickly to effective range. As the fleets maneuvered toward each other, Perry faced his first tactical crisis. His carefully planned battle formation was falling apart due to wind conditions. Ships were strung out in an irregular line, some vessels unable to keep up with the flagship. The precise coordination his strategy required was being disrupted by forces beyond his control. Perry had planned for Lawrence to engage Barclay's flagship Detroit, while Niagara, commanded by Lieutenant Jesse Duncan Elliott, would engage Queen Charlotte. The smaller vessels would support as able, harassing the British line and preventing enemy ships from concentrating fire. It was a sound plan that depended on every ship reaching its designated position simultaneously. The wind wasn't cooperating. At 12:45, the first shots were fired. British long-range guns began pounding Lawrence while Perry was still too far away to return effective fire. This was exactly the scenario Perry had hoped to avoid, taking punishment without being able to dish it out. For 45 agonizing minutes, Perry's flagship absorbed terrible punishment while trying to close distance. British gunners were experienced and accurate, their shots methodically dismantling Lawrence's structure. The sound was indescribable. Crashes that shook the entire ship, screams that cut through the roar of cannons, splintering wood that sent deadly missiles in every direction. The deck became slippery with blood, despite sand that sailors had spread in grim preparation. The air grew thick with gunpowder smoke that stung eyes and choked lungs. Wounded men were dragged below decks to the surgeon's makeshift operating theater, where amputation and cauterization were performed without anesthesia, where survival depended more on luck than medical skill. Perry remained on deck throughout this punishment, encouraging his men, directing the ship's response, maintaining the visible leadership that kept Lawrence's crew fighting when lesser men would have broken. Naval battles were won or lost based on crew morale as much as firepower. Seeing their captain calmly giving orders under fire kept the sailors at their posts, kept them loading and firing even as friends died beside them, kept them functioning despite terror and exhaustion. Perry's uniform grew shredded from near misses. His face became black with powder smoke. But he never left the deck, never sought shelter, never showed anything but determination and confidence. The most controversial aspect of the battle was unfolding simultaneously. Perry's second in command, Lieutenant Jesse Duncan Elliott commanding Niagara, was supposed to be supporting Lawrence by engaging Queen Charlotte. Instead, Elliott held back, staying at long range where his guns were less effective. The reasons for Elliott's behavior became a source of bitter controversy that lasted decades. Elliott claimed he was following Perry's battle plan, which called for each ship to engage a specific opponent. Perry's supporters argued that Elliott should have adapted to changing circumstances and provided support where it was most needed. Whether Elliott was being cautious, cowardly, or simply following orders too literally, the tactical result was devastating. Lawrence was being pounded to pieces while taking on multiple British ships essentially alone. Perry's battle plan was failing, and his flagship was being destroyed. Perry stood at the forward part of Lawrence's quarterdeck, hands gripping the rail as another British broadside crashed into his ship's hull. Wood exploded in clouds of splinters that whistled past his head like malevolent insects. Somewhere below, a man screamed in the particular pitch that meant mortal wounding. The mainmast swayed, held upright more by habit than structural integrity. Perry could see Niagara offshore, her sails bright and undamaged in the midday sun, staying at safe distance while Lawrence absorbed the full weight of British fury. Something hot and bitter rose in Perry's throat, rage or despair, he couldn't tell which, and forcing it down required physical effort. By 2:30 in the afternoon, Lawrence was a floating wreck. Perry did a quick mental count of the carnage around him. 83 casualties from a crew of 103. The mathematical precision of that number felt obscene, reducing men to statistics while their blood pooled in the scuppers. Most guns were destroyed or dismounted, their crews dead or too wounded to serve. The ship barely responded to the helm, steering tackle shot away, rigging hanging in tangled masses that swayed like dying limbs. Water seeped through hull planking, holed in a dozen places. Any normal naval commander would strike colors now, haul down the flag and surrender with honor, intact after such resistance. The Lawrence had fought courageously against overwhelming odds. No court-martial would fault Perry for admitting defeat. But Perry wasn't thinking about honor or courts-martial. He was thinking about James Lawrence dying on Chesapeake's deck, about that blue flag with white letters still flying, despite everything, about 400 men across his squadron who trusted him with their lives. He was thinking about Elizabeth, pregnant in Rhode Island, about the Northwest Territory hanging in the balance, about the impossible mission he'd accepted 9 months ago when this all seemed like frontier madness. Surrender meant all of it: the wilderness shipyard, the diverse crew nobody thought would fight together, the months of drilling and planning and hoping would end in British prison camps and American defeat. Perry looked across 400 yards of smoke-hazed water to where Niagara sat relatively undamaged, her sails clean and bright, her hull mostly intact from staying at long range throughout the morning's butchery. Jesse Elliott had kept that ship safe by refusing to bring her into close action. The tactical failure made Perry's jaw clench so hard his teeth ached, but recriminations could wait. Right now, Niagara represented the only American vessel with full firepower still available. If Perry could reach her, transfer his command, he could still bring fresh guns and a full crew into the fight. The British were damaged too. Detroit and Queen Charlotte both showed the effects of sustained combat. One aggressive push with Niagara's intact broadside might shatter their formation completely. The decision formed in Perry's mind with crystalline clarity. He would abandon Lawrence, transfer command to Niagara, and continue the battle with a fresh ship. It was unprecedented in naval warfare. Flag officers didn't abandon their flagships mid-battle and row across active combat zones to take command of other vessels. The entire concept violated traditional understanding of how naval combat worked. Captains were supposed to go down with their ships if necessary, die at their posts, accept defeat with dignity when circumstances demanded it. They weren't supposed to grab battle flags and row through cannonball-churned water, seeking another platform from which to continue fighting. Perry called for Lieutenant Yarnall, his first officer, who came limping forward with a splinter wound in his thigh that left his trouser leg dark with blood. Yarnall's face was gray beneath powder smoke, exhaustion and blood loss combining to make him sway slightly as he stood. Perry gripped his arm to steady him, felt the tremor running through the younger man's frame. The words came out flat, brooking no argument. "I'm transferring my command to Niagara. You'll strike colors after I'm clear." Yarnall's eyes widened, shock cutting through fatigue. "Sir, this is madness. You'll be killed crossing that distance. British guns will tear your boat apart." Perry was already moving toward the ship's cutter, still tied alongside despite the battle raging around it. "We didn't build these ships to surrender them, Lieutenant. Tell the crew they fought with honor. Their sacrifice won't be wasted." The battle flag came down from Lawrence's splintered mainmast, that blue banner still intact despite everything, still spelling out its uncompromising message. Perry took it himself, wouldn't trust anyone else with this particular burden. 4 sailors volunteered for the boat crew without being asked. Among them was Hannibal Collins, left shoulder bloody from a splinter wound, but still able to pull an oar. Perry looked at the young black sailor, saw determination in eyes that had watched friends die all morning. His voice came out softer than intended. "You're wounded." Hannibal's response carried quiet steel. "I can still row, sir." The cutter dropped into water churned gray-green by wind and wake. 5 men total, Perry standing in the stern holding the battle flag like some medieval knight's standard. 4 sailors at the oars. The British were still firing at Lawrence, hadn't yet noticed the small boat pushing away from the dying flagship. 400 yards of open water stretched between Perry and Niagara, every foot of it covered by British guns that would eventually see this impossible crossing and try to stop it. Hannibal pulled his oar with steady rhythm, despite the wound in his shoulder, sending fire down his arm with each stroke. He faced aft, looking at Perry rather than where they were going, and the sight was something he'd remember for the rest of his life. The Commodore stood fully upright in the stern, battle flag streaming in the breeze, sword drawn, completely exposed to enemy fire. Any normal officer would crouch in the boat's bottom, minimize his profile, try to survive the crossing. Perry stood tall, as if daring British gunners to try their aim, as if the sheer audacity of this act would protect him through force of will alone. British gun crews finally noticed. Waterspouts erupted around the cutter as cannonballs hit water, sending spray high enough to drench the boat's occupants. One shot passed so close Hannibal felt the displacement of air, a physical presence that made his skin crawl with primal fear. But the Commodore didn't flinch, didn't duck, just kept standing there with that blue flag snapping overhead. Something about Perry's absolute refusal to show fear steadied Hannibal's rowing. If the Commodore could stand up there waiting for death, Hannibal could keep pulling his oar no matter how his shoulder screamed. American sailors on the other ships saw Perry's boat and began cheering, voices carrying across water despite the cannon fire. The Commodore wasn't giving up. Lawrence might be finished, but Perry was still fighting. The psychological impact rippled through the American fleet like wind across water. Men who'd been thinking about surrender or retreat saw their commander rowing through a battlefield and found renewed determination. Small ships that had been hanging back suddenly surged forward, pressing attacks with fresh aggression. The entire dynamic shifted because one man refused to accept defeat even after his flagship was destroyed. British sailors watched with something approaching disbelief. Enemy commanders didn't do this. Naval battles had rules, traditions, expectations about how defeat was acknowledged and victory accepted. Perry was violating every norm of maritime combat, and his audacity created a moment of psychological dislocation that affected British morale as profoundly as it lifted American spirits. If the American commander was desperate enough or crazy enough to row across an active battlefield, what else might he try? What unconventional tactics would he employ once he reached that fresh ship? Certainty wavered, and in naval combat, certainty was everything. The cutter bumped against Niagara's hull. Perry grabbed the rope ladder and climbed, battle flag clutched in one hand, sword in the other, moving with the practiced ease of a man who'd spent his life going up and down ship's sides. He reached the deck and found Jesse Elliott waiting with an expression that mixed surprise, shame, and something darker that might have been resentment. The two men stood facing each other for a moment that stretched taut with unspoken accusation. Perry's voice came out cold as January lake water. "I'm taking command. You'll take the boat to the smaller vessels and direct them forward." Elliot opened his mouth to speak, perhaps to explain or justify or defend his morning's performance. Perry's expression stopped whatever words were forming. This wasn't the moment for explanations or excuses. Elliot nodded once, tight and bitter, then climbed down to the waiting cutter. The boat pushed off toward the schooners and sloops, carrying away a man whose reputation would never fully recover from this September afternoon. Perry planted the battle flag on Niagara's mainmast. The crew gathered on deck stared at their new commander, a man covered in powder smoke and blood, uniform torn, face set in an expression of absolute determination. These sailors were fresh compared to Lawrence's survivors. They'd spent the morning engaging at long range, taking only minor casualties, watching their sister ship get destroyed while their cautious captain kept them safe. Some felt guilt about that, others relief, most a confused mixture of both. Now Perry stood before them, and everyone could see this commander wouldn't keep them safe, wouldn't hold back, would drive them directly into the teeth of British guns. Perry's voice carried across the deck without him needing to shout. Decades of seamanship teaching him how to project authority through tone and bearing. "Gentlemen, Lawrence fought bravely. Now Niagara will finish what she started. All hands prepare for close action. We're going through their line." The crew exploded into motion. Gun crews checked their cannons with renewed urgency, making sure every piece was loaded and ready. Sail handlers stood by lines, prepared to adjust canvas for maximum maneuverability. Officers checked divisions, ensuring every man knew his station and role. Niagara transformed from a ship that had spent the morning avoiding danger into a weapon preparing to strike with full force. The change came from Perry's presence as much as his orders. This was a commander who radiated offensive intent, who viewed the damaged British fleet not as a threat to be cautiously engaged, but as a target to be destroyed. Hannibal found himself assigned to a new gun crew on Niagara's main deck, his wounded shoulder forgotten in the sudden rush of preparation. The gun captain here was different from McDougal. Younger, American-born, a veteran of coastal actions against British frigates. His name was Peters, and his voice carried the flat vowels of Massachusetts when he spoke to his crew. The words were simple, direct, carrying weight beyond their surface, meaning, "We're the hammer this time, not the anvil." Niagara's hull shuddered as Perry ordered full sail. The ship surged forward, picking up speed, cutting through water toward the British line with aggressive intent that contrasted sharply with the morning's cautious, long-range duel. Perry stood on the quarterdeck, studying the British formation with a tactical eye that saw opportunity in their damage. Detroit and Queen Charlotte were battered from the extended engagement with Lawrence. Both ships showed shot damage in their hulls. Rigging disrupted, sails holed. More critically, Captain Barclay had been wounded and carried below, leaving his flagship's command to less experienced officers during the battle's crucial phase. Command continuity was broken at precisely the moment it mattered most. Perry saw his chance and took it with the kind of aggressive timing that couldn't be taught, only developed through instinct and experience. He ordered Niagara to cut directly through the British line in a maneuver called crossing the T, a classic naval tactic that allowed one ship to fire raking broadsides into multiple enemy vessels while they struggled to bring their own guns to bear. The maneuver required precise ship handling, perfect timing, and absolute confidence in your crew's ability to execute complex sailing while under fire. Perry demanded all of it without hesitation. Niagara knifed through the gap between Detroit and Queen Charlotte, her full broadside erupting in controlled fury. 20 guns fired in rippling sequence, each cannon belching flame and iron toward British hulls at devastatingly close range. The carronades that had been useless at long range became instruments of systematic destruction when fired from 50 yards. 32-pound balls crashed into wooden hulls, smashing through planking, shattering frames, creating clouds of splinters that scythed through British crews. The sound was overwhelming, a continuous roar punctuated by crashes as iron met wood, screams as men died or were maimed, the peculiar whistling of rigging parts snapping under stress. Hannibal's gun crew loaded and fired with mechanical precision, the drill Perry had insisted on during those August training sessions, paying off in reduced loading time and accurate aim. Load the powder cartridge, ram it home, add the ball, ram again, prime the touch hole, stand clear, fire. The routine consumed Hannibal's consciousness, leaving no room for fear or doubt. Each shot visibly struck British hulls, and there was grim satisfaction in that, despite the horror of what each impact meant for men on the receiving end. Detroit tried to maneuver to bring more guns to bear, but her damaged rigging responded sluggishly. Queen Charlotte attempted to support her flagship, turning toward Niagara with aggressive intent. But the turn brought her too close to Detroit, and the two British ships collided with a grinding crash that locked their hulls together. Rigging tangled between the vessels, trapping both in an embrace that prevented effective maneuvering. The collision was pure bad luck for the British, the kind of chance occurrence that battle conditions made more probable, but never inevitable. Two of Barclay's most powerful ships were now sitting ducks, unable to move effectively, while American guns pounded them at close range. Perry didn't let up. Niagara continued through the British line, firing both broadsides now, engaging targets to port and starboard, with the kind of aggressive gunnery that decided naval battles. The American small ships, inspired by Perry's example and directed forward by Elliott's belated leadership, finally closed to effective range. Scorpion, Ariel, and Porcupine harassed the British flanks, their lighter guns adding to the iron storm that was systematically destroying Barclay's squadron. Lady Prevost took repeated hits at the waterline and began settling lower in the water, taking on flooding faster than her pumps could handle. General Hunter found herself surrounded by American vessels, taking fire from multiple directions simultaneously, her crew's morale breaking under the sustained assault. The battle that had seemed like certain British victory at noon transformed into American triumph by 2:30. One by one, British ships struck their colors. Lady Prevost hauled down her flag first, sinking condition forcing surrender before casualties mounted further. Detroit followed, her acting commander making the painful but necessary decision that continuing to fight would simply get more men killed for no tactical gain. Queen Charlotte, still tangled with Detroit, struck almost simultaneously. General Hunter surrendered after her commanding officer fell wounded, and her first lieutenant realized continued resistance was futile. Only Little Belt managed to escape, using light winds and shallow draft to flee toward the Canadian shore, while American ships were occupied securing prizes. At 3 o'clock, the last British flag came down. Perry stood on Niagara's quarterdeck, surrounded by the detritus of naval combat. Torn rigging, splattered blood, powder smoke so thick it made eyes water, and felt something release in his chest that he hadn't even realized was clenched. They'd won. Against superior enemy experience, despite his flagship being destroyed, through sheer refusal to accept defeat, Perry's squadron had achieved complete victory. 6 British ships captured or destroyed. Control of Lake Erie secured. The Northwest Territory saved. The impossible mission accomplished through innovation, determination, and willingness to break every rule about how naval battles were supposed to be fought. But victory's taste was complicated by the human cost. The sudden silence after hours of cannon fire felt oppressive, almost threatening. Without the roar of guns to mask them, other sounds became audible. Wounded men crying for water, officers shouting orders to secure prizes, the creak of damaged hulls settling, wind whistling through torn rigging. Perry's first action was characteristically practical. Secure prisoners, render aid to wounded, begin damage assessment. The battle was over, but the work had barely begun. British officers were brought aboard Niagara under guard. Lieutenant Irvine, who'd commanded Detroit after Barclay fell, looked haggard and defeated. His uniform was torn, face blackened by powder smoke, eyes carrying the particular hollow quality of a man who'd watched friends die and been unable to prevent it. Perry met him at the quarterdeck rail, and something in Irvine's expression, resignation mixed with grudging respect, made Perry's response instinctive. His voice came out surprisingly gentle. "Your men fought bravely, Lieutenant. They've nothing to be ashamed of." Irvine's throat worked before words came. "Where is Captain Barclay?" Perry gestured toward the hatchway leading below. "Our surgeon is attending him. The wounds are serious, but he may survive." The deck around them was organized chaos. Sailors lashing guns, carpenters assessing damage, officers gathering reports. Perry let Irvine stand there for a moment, not rushing the British officer, understanding that surrender required its own processing time. Finally, Irvine's shoulders straightened slightly, some remnant of military bearing reasserting itself despite defeat. The words came out formal, almost ritualistic. "My compliments to your surgeon, Commodore, and my respects for a masterfully fought action." Below decks on both fleets, the surgeon's work continued with methodical horror. Ship surgeons in this era were pragmatic men who learned their trade through necessity rather than formal medical education. They knew how to amputate limbs with reasonable speed, cauterize wounds with hot iron to prevent bleeding, extract splinters and musket balls from flesh. But they had no anesthesia beyond rum and leather straps to bite on, no antibiotics, no real understanding of infection beyond empirical observation that some wounds festered and killed men days after the battle ended. Survival depended more on luck and constitution than medical intervention. Niagara's surgeon, Dr. Usher Parsons, worked in the midship area that served as operating theater during battle. The space was cramped, dark, lit by lanterns that cast shadows across wounded men waiting their turn. Blood made the deck planking slick despite repeated swabbing. The smell was indescribable. Blood, vomit, voided bowels, fierce sweat, all mixed with the persistent reek of gunpowder smoke that clung to everything. Parsons moved between patients with grim efficiency, making rapid assessments about who could be saved and who was beyond help. The calculus was brutal but necessary. Limited time and supplies meant choosing where effort would make a difference. A young powder monkey, maybe 13 years old, lay with both legs shattered below the knee from a cannonball that had ricocheted across the gun deck. His face was gray with shock, eyes unfocused, breathing shallow. Parsons examined the wounds and knew amputation offered the boy's only chance. But double amputation meant extended surgery time, massive blood loss, recovery that would take months if he survived at all. Other wounded men waited with injuries Parsons could treat more quickly, with better survival odds. The utilitarian calculation was clear and heartbreaking. Parsons made his choice and moved to the next patient. The powder monkey would die untreated, and Parsons would carry that decision forever. This was the hidden cost of naval victory, the medical triage that meant some men died not because their wounds were necessarily fatal, but because saving them would consume resources better used elsewhere. Parsons had made such choices before and would make them again. The necessity didn't make it easier. Hannibal found himself pressed into service helping below decks, his own wounds superficial enough to ignore. He held men down during amputations, hands gripping shoulders while surgeons sawed through bone, and men screamed despite leather bits clenched between their teeth. He fetched water for the wounded to drink, knowing many would die before morning, regardless of how much water they consumed. He delivered last messages from dying men to officers who would write letters to widows and mothers. One of the wounded was Samuel Davis from Hannibal's original gun crew on Lawrence. Davis had lost his hand to cannonball strike during the morning's fighting, the stump cauterized and bandaged. He'd survived the initial trauma and seemed likely to recover, but infection was setting in despite the surgeon's best efforts. Davis's forehead felt hot when Hannibal touched it, fever spiking in a way that meant poison spreading through blood. Within hours, Davis was delirious, calling for his wife Sarah back in Kentucky, describing crops that needed harvesting and children who needed feeding. By midnight, he was dead, killed not by British iron, but by bacteria invading his bloodstream through the ragged amputation site. Hannibal sat with Davis at the end, holding the man's remaining hand, providing human contact during the final dissolution. When Davis's breathing stopped, Hannibal closed the eyes and said a prayer his mother had taught him years ago. Then he returned to helping the surgeon with other wounded men, because stopping would mean thinking about all the deaths surrounding him, and thinking might break something that needed to stay intact until this was over. Captain Barclay survived his wounds, though barely. Dr. Parsons treated him with the same care given to American wounded, following Perry's explicit orders that captured enemy officers receive full medical attention. Barclay had suffered multiple injuries: shoulder wound, thigh wound, severe blood loss. The fact that he'd already lost his left arm at Trafalgar complicated treatment. Blood vessels that might have been clamped or tied off in a normal patient were scarred and rerouted from his earlier amputation. Parsons worked for an hour stabilizing the British captain, aware that this man represented something larger than just another casualty. Barclay was a Trafalgar veteran, one-armed hero of the Royal Navy, now captured and broken by American innovation and determination. When Barclay regained consciousness, Perry visited him in the improvised sick bay. The British captain looked diminished, face pale from blood loss, body reduced by injury and defeat. But his eyes still carried intelligence and that particular brand of professional competency that transcended national loyalty. Perry pulled up a stool beside Barclay's hammock, sitting with the kind of easy familiarity that might exist between colleagues rather than enemies. Barclay's voice came out weak but steady. "American commander, you won." Perry's response carried no triumph. "You fought magnificently, Captain. Your men were very brave." Barclay's throat worked, processing not just defeat but the manner of it. That boat crossing, incredible. Never seen anything like it. The words hung between them, acknowledgement of the unconventional tactic that had turned certain defeat into unlikely victory. Perry felt the weight of what that crossing represented. Not just tactical innovation, but fundamental refusal to accept the constraints that traditional naval warfare imposed. He'd broken the rules because the rules would have meant losing, and losing would have meant everything he'd worked for since March became pointless. Barclay continued, words coming with effort. "My men. How many?" Perry provided the grim accounting. 41 killed, 94 wounded from your squadron. Our losses were 27 dead, 96 wounded, nearly 30% casualties across both fleets. The mathematical precision of those numbers failed to capture what they meant. 258 individual human beings killed or wounded, each one a son or father or husband or friend. each one leaving a hole in some family that would never properly heal. Barclay closed his eyes and Perry saw moisture gathering at the corners. Whether from pain or grief or simple exhaustion, Perry couldn't tell and didn't ask. Perry stood to leave, then paused with one final observation. Our surgeon believes you'll survive, Captain. That's something. By 4 o'clock, Perry had returned to Niagara's quarterdeck to begin the administrative requirements of victory. The first priority was informing General William Henry Harrison, who waited with an American army in Ohio for news that would determine whether his planned invasion of Canada could proceed. Perry took paper and quill, considering what words could adequately convey the magnitude of what had just occurred. Grand pronouncements felt wrong. Detailed tactical analysis would come later in official reports. What Harrison needed immediately was simple information. Had Perry won or lost? Were British naval forces destroyed or still dangerous? Could the army move or must it wait? Perry's hand moved across paper with the kind of elegant economy that made his dispatch one of the most famous messages in American military history. Dear General, we have met the enemy and they are ours. 2 ships, 2 brigs, 1 schooner, and 1 sloop. Yours with great respect and esteem, O.H. Perry. 22 words that announced complete victory and changed the strategic calculus of the entire war. Perry sealed the letter, handed it to a messenger who would carry it by fast boat to Harrison's headquarters. Then he wrote a longer report to Secretary of the Navy William Jones, providing tactical details and praising specific officers and crew members who distinguished themselves during the action. He mentioned Lawrence's sacrifice, credited the diverse crew with fighting beyond expectations, carefully avoided criticizing Elliott's performance, despite private fury about the Niagara's late entry into close action. Public disputes about officer performance could wait until after the war. Right now, maintaining fleet cohesion mattered more than settling scores. As evening approached, Perry ordered boats to take him back to Lawrence. The battered flagship drifted with minimal steerage, still afloat but barely. Perry climbed aboard and found the deck even worse than he remembered. Splintered planking, dismounted guns, blood-stained wood that spoke of morning's horrific casualties. Lieutenant Yarnall met him with a weary salute. The surviving crew gathered on deck, maybe 20 men who'd lived through 83 casualties, their faces showing the particular exhaustion that comes from sustained combat and miraculous survival. Perry's voice carried across the ruined deck. You held when everyone expected you to break. You fought beyond what anyone could ask. Lawrence's crew will be remembered as long as men tell stories about courage and sacrifice. The words sounded inadequate even as Perry spoke them. How did you properly honor men who'd absorbed punishment meant to destroy them, who'd kept fighting despite impossible odds, who'd bought time with their blood for Perry's desperate boat crossing? The surviving crew members stood a bit straighter despite exhaustion, finding some small measure of pride in what they'd endured. They'd been part of something larger than individual survival, something that would echo through American naval history long after their names were forgotten. Perry walked among the gun positions, seeing where men had died at their posts, where blood marked final positions. He found the spot where Hannibal's original gun crew had served. Liberty, they'd named their cannon, though the weapon itself was now dismounted and half buried in splintered deck planking. Murphy's blood still stained the wood where the Irishman had died from a splinter through his throat. Davis had lost his hand here before infection finished what British iron started. Perry stood there for a long moment, thinking about diverse crews and American potential, about how these men had fought together despite a nation that still practiced slavery, despite prejudices that said different races couldn't function as unified military units. As darkness fell, Perry ordered Lawrence taken under tow. The ship was too damaged to sail independently, but too symbolically important to abandon. She would be repaired eventually, brought back to service, though she'd never fully recover from this afternoon's punishment. For now, Lawrence represented what American determination could accomplish against superior enemy forces, battered, bloodied, but ultimately triumphant through sheer refusal to surrender. The night after battle brought its own peculiar atmosphere. Men who'd been trying to kill each other hours earlier now worked side by side securing prizes and treating wounded. British sailors found themselves receiving care from American surgeons, eating American rations, sleeping in spaces provided by their captors. The formalities of 18th century warfare dictated certain courtesies between professional military men. Prisoners were treated with respect, wounded were cared for regardless of nationality, the dead were honored. These traditions cushioned the absolute brutality of combat, made it possible for men to return to something resembling normal human behavior after spending hours inflicting systematic violence on each other. Perry spent the evening visiting wounded on all the ships, American and British alike. He knew many wounded wouldn't survive the night despite medical attention. Infection, blood loss, shock, these killed almost as efficiently as cannonballs, just more slowly. He sat with dying men, held their hands, promised to write letters to families, delivered final words to officers who would attempt the impossible task of conveying last thoughts to wives and mothers and children. Some men were coherent at the end, delivering clear messages about love and regret. Others were delirious, calling for people who weren't present, confused about where they were and what had happened. Perry stayed with them regardless, providing human presence during transition from life to death. One dying sailor, a British gunner named Thomas Webb, grabbed Perry's hand with surprising strength and pulled him close. Webb's chest wound was mortal, punctured lung making each breath a gurgling agony, but his eyes were clear and focused. His voice came out in broken whispers that Perry had to lean in to hear. The words were simple, profound in their ordinariness. Tell my Mary, loved her, every day, every single day. Perry promised he would, knowing he'd likely never locate Mary Webb somewhere in Britain. Knowing the promise itself mattered more than practical fulfillment. Webb died minutes later, hands still gripping Perry's, and Perry sat there for several more minutes before gently extracting himself and moving to the next wounded man. By midnight, Perry found himself alone in Niagara's cabin, finally able to process the day's events in private. His uniform was ruined, torn and blood-stained beyond repair. His body ached from sustained tension, muscles protesting hours of standing and moving without rest. But physical exhaustion was manageable. The emotional weight was harder. Responsibility for 258 casualties, decisions made in seconds that determined who lived and died. The boat crossing that could have gotten him killed and left the fleet leaderless. Perry poured a small measure of rum, hands shaking slightly now that no one was watching, and allowed himself to feel the fear he'd suppressed during the battle. He'd come within yards of death multiple times. That cannonball near the boat had missed by inches. If British gunners had been slightly more accurate, if wind had shifted the boat's course by a few feet, if luck had broken differently, Perry would be dead and the battle lost. The victory wasn't inevitable or guaranteed. It resulted from precise combination of preparation, timing, tactical innovation, and pure chance. Remove any single element and the outcome reversed. British victory, American defeat, Northwest Territory lost. Perry's body wrapped in canvas and slid overboard with appropriate ceremony. The letter he'd written to Elizabeth was still in his sea chest, unfinished and unsent. Perry retrieved it, read what he'd written the night before battle, and felt the distance between that uncertain commander and whoever he'd become during the crossing. The man who wrote those doubts-filled lines seemed like a stranger now, someone Perry had known once but grown apart from. He picked up the quill, added a final paragraph. The words came easier now, certainty replacing doubt. Elizabeth, if this reaches you, know that I kept my honor. I refused to surrender when surrender seemed reasonable. I gave everything the moment demanded and discovered I was enough. James would be proud. I am coming home. Perry sealed the letter, addressed it, then placed it back in his chest. This one would be sent, delivered regardless of what happened next, because Elizabeth deserved to know that her husband had faced the impossible and prevailed. General William Henry Harrison received Perry's dispatch on September 12th, 2 days after the battle. The message arrived by fast courier, a young naval lieutenant who'd ridden through the night from Put-in-Bay to Harrison's headquarters near Sandusky. Harrison read the 22 words once, then again, before allowing himself to believe what they meant. The British fleet was destroyed. Lake Erie belonged to America. The entire strategic situation had reversed in 3 hours of September afternoon combat. Harrison immediately ordered preparations for the invasion of Canada. With British naval power eliminated, Nothing prevented American forces from crossing Lake Erie and striking at the heart of enemy-held territory. Within days, Harrison's army, 4,500 men including Kentucky militia and regular infantry, began boarding Perry's ships for transport across the lake. The vessels that had fought so desperately on September 10th now became troop transports, carrying American soldiers toward objectives that had seemed impossible just weeks earlier. Detroit, abandoned by British forces unable to maintain supply lines without naval superiority, fell back into American hands without a shot fired. The humiliating surrender of August 1812 was reversed, the stain partially removed from national honor. By late September, British General Henry Proctor found himself in an untenable position. His supply lines were severed, his Native American allies were wavering, American forces were landing in Canada with overwhelming numbers. Proctor ordered a retreat deeper into Canadian territory, abandoning defensive positions that had held for over a year. The great Shawnee leader, Tecumseh, who'd spent years building a confederation of Native American tribes to resist American expansion, found his British allies melting away just when their support mattered most. Tecumseh's dream of an independent Native American state between American and British territories depended entirely on British military success. Without that support, the dream was dying. On October 5, 1813, Harrison's pursuing army caught Proctor's retreating forces at the Thames River in Ontario. The battle was brief and decisive. British resistance collapsed under American assault. Tecumseh died fighting, though exactly how and where his body fell became subject to conflicting accounts and legend. What mattered strategically was that the most capable and visionary Native American leader was gone, killed in a battle that happened because Perry destroyed British naval power on Lake Erie. The domino effect Perry's victory initiated reached far beyond naval warfare. It reshaped the entire Northwest Territory, ended organized Native American resistance, opened vast regions to American settlement. The consequences rippled through Native American communities with devastating finality. Tribes that had allied with Tecumseh's Confederation found themselves without leadership, without British support, facing American forces emboldened by recent victories. Treaties were imposed that stripped away tribal lands. Forced relocations began, pushing Native peoples westward ahead of American expansion. The culture, traditions, and sovereignty of dozens of tribes were crushed beneath the weight of American manifest destiny. Perry's victory was their catastrophe, though Perry himself probably never fully grasped the magnitude of destruction his September afternoon unleashed on Native American civilization. Hannibal Collins understood something of this bitter irony. In the weeks after the battle, as Perry's fleet transported Harrison's army and then returned to more routine duties, Hannibal had conversations with other black sailors about what their victory meant. They'd fought bravely for America, proven their worth in combat, demonstrated that courage and capability weren't determined by race. Yet they returned to a nation where slavery remained legal, where freed black men faced constant discrimination, where the rights they'd fought to defend didn't fully extend to people who looked like them. And the territories they'd helped secure would eventually become states that practiced slavery or at minimum refused to grant black citizens full equality. One evening in late October, Hannibal sat with 3 other black sailors on Niagara's deck while the ship rode at anchor near Erie, Pennsylvania. The conversation turned philosophical in the way that military service sometimes prompted, men wrestling with larger questions about duty and justice and the gap between America's stated ideals and lived reality. Marcus, a former slave who'd bought his freedom and enlisted, voiced what they were all thinking. "We proved we can fight. We proved we're equal in battle. But nothing's changed on shore. We're still less than white men in their eyes." Hannibal's response carried hard-won wisdom. "Maybe nothing changes today, but we're building something. Evidence. Proof. Future generations will point to us and say, they fought, they bled, they earned equality. It's a brick in a foundation, not the whole building." The analogy felt inadequate even as Hannibal spoke it. How many bricks? How many black sailors would have to prove their worth before America granted the equality it claimed to cherish? The question had no satisfactory answer, but Hannibal chose to believe service mattered, that his presence on that boat rowing Perry across the battlefield meant something beyond just military necessity. History required heroes of all colors, and if Hannibal's story helped chip away at racist assumptions, then the blood and fear had purpose beyond immediate victory. News of Perry's triumph reached the eastern seaboard by late September, and the reaction was immediate and overwhelming. A nation that had endured defeat after defeat suddenly had a clear, unambiguous victory to celebrate. Perry's dispatch, "We have met the enemy and they are ours," was published in newspapers from Boston to Charleston. The phrase became instant legend, quotable and confident, exactly the kind of aggressive American spirit people wanted to hear after months of British dominance. Songs were written celebrating the battle, poems composed in Perry's honor. Editorial writers praised the victory as proof that American determination could overcome British military superiority. The timing mattered enormously. The War of 1812 had been deeply unpopular in many parts of the country, especially New England, where merchants opposed the conflict's impact on trade with Britain. Federalist politicians had argued the war was unwinnable, that Madison's administration was leading the country toward disaster, that peace with Britain on almost any terms was preferable to continued fighting. Perry's victory undermined those arguments by demonstrating American forces could win decisive engagements against veteran British troops and sailors. Public opinion began shifting, not immediately or universally, but enough to give the war effort renewed political viability. Congress voted Perry formal thanks and a gold medal, rare honors that reflected his achievements' significance. He was promoted to captain at age 28, becoming one of the youngest officers to hold that rank in the Navy's short history. State legislatures passed resolutions praising his service. Pennsylvania gifted him land near Erie, acknowledging his role in securing their frontier. Prize money from captured British vessels made Perry financially comfortable for the first time in his life. Fame, honor, wealth, all the traditional rewards of military success came to Perry in the months after Lake Erie. Yet Perry himself remained characteristically modest about the victory. When he finally returned to Rhode Island in late October for his first visit home since March, he deflected praise toward his crew and officers. At public ceremonies in Newport, Perry insisted that victory belonged to 400 sailors who'd fought with courage, not to any single commander. He mentioned Lawrence's crew by name when possible, ensuring their sacrifice wasn't forgotten in the celebration of final triumph. He shared prize money beyond what naval regulations required, distributing wealth to families of dead sailors and men too wounded to continue service. Elizabeth Perry met her husband at Newport Harbor on a cold November morning, 7 months pregnant and barely containing the emotions that had built since September when news of the battle first reached her. She'd lived with uncertainty for months, knowing Oliver was building ships in wilderness, knowing battle was inevitable, wondering each day if she'd become a widow before her child was born. The dispatch announcing victory had brought relief mixed with continued fear. Oliver alive, but how badly wounded? Would he survive injuries that might kill him weeks after combat ended? The answers came slowly through additional letters and reports, each one easing her dread incrementally until finally Oliver himself stood before her on the dock. They embraced without speaking, 7 months of separation and fear dissolving in physical contact. Elizabeth felt Oliver's arms around her, solid and real. No longer just words on paper, but living presence. When they finally separated enough to look at each other, Elizabeth saw changes in Oliver's face that went deeper than exhaustion or powder burns. Something fundamental had shifted in her husband's bearing, a confidence that came from facing the worst and discovering he was equal to it. Her voice came out steadier than she felt. "You kept your promise. You came home." Oliver touched her swollen belly gently, connection with the child he'd never met. "I had reasons to survive. You, the children, this little one who's decided to wait for father before arriving." They walked together through Newport streets toward the Perry family home, surrounded by townspeople who wanted to congratulate the returning hero. Oliver acknowledged them with polite nods but refused to stop for formal conversation. He needed private time with Elizabeth, needed to reconnect with the life he'd left behind in March when this whole impossible mission began. The children, Elizabeth at 5, Jane at 3, barely recognized their father at first, shy and uncertain around this man they'd been told stories about but hadn't seen in so long. Oliver sat on the floor with them, patient and gentle, letting them approach at their own pace, rebuilding bonds that military service had strained. That evening, alone in their bedroom while children slept and house settled into night quiet, Elizabeth and Oliver finally spoke honestly about what the battle had cost and meant. Oliver described the boat crossing, the decision to abandon Lawrence, the minutes when death seemed more probable than survival. Elizabeth listened without interrupting, understanding her husband needed to articulate experiences that couldn't be fully conveyed in letters or public speeches. When Oliver finished, Elizabeth's response cut to the essential truth. You discovered you were the man who wouldn't surrender. Now you'll spend the rest of your life living up to that standard. The observation carried weight beyond immediate context. Perry had set a benchmark for himself that September afternoon, demonstrated a level of determination and courage that became inseparable from his identity. Future assignments, future challenges, would all be measured against Lake Erie. Could he maintain that standard? Would other situations demand similar sacrifice? The victory was glorious, but it also created expectations that might prove impossible to consistently meet. Elizabeth delivered their third child in December 1813, a son they named Oliver Hazard Perry II. Perry held his newborn son and felt the familiar weight of responsibility. This child would grow up hearing stories about September 10th, 1813, would be expected to live up to a father's legend. The burden wasn't fair, but was inevitable. Perry children would always be judged against their father's achievement, always asked to measure themselves against an afternoon of desperate courage that would be retold and embellished with each passing year. The war continued into 1814, though Perry's direct involvement diminished. He was assigned to coastal defense, commanding squadrons that protected American ports from British raids. The work was necessary but lacked the dramatic stakes of Lake Erie. In August 1814, British forces burned Washington, D.C. in retaliation for American destruction of Canadian government buildings. The sight of the Capitol building in flames shocked Americans who'd believed their capital city was immune to enemy attack. Perry wasn't present for Washington's burning, was stationed in Rhode Island when news arrived, but he felt the national humiliation acutely. His Lake Erie victory had provided temporary psychological boost, but the war's outcome remained uncertain. September 1814 brought the Battle of Lake Champlain, where American naval forces under Commodore Thomas MacDonough defeated a British squadron in circumstances that echoed Perry's triumph. MacDonough used similar aggressive tactics, refused to surrender despite taking heavy damage, ultimately achieved complete victory through determination and tactical innovation. The parallels weren't coincidental. Perry's example influenced how other American naval commanders approached seemingly impossible situations. The lesson of Lake Erie was that aggressive action and refusal to accept defeat could overcome superior enemy forces. MacDonough applied that lesson successfully, adding another decisive naval victory to American achievement. By late 1814, both America and Britain were exhausted by the conflict. Britain faced economic strain from simultaneous wars against America and France. America's treasury was nearly empty, financing the war through loans and bonds that threatened national solvency. Neither side could achieve decisive victory, and continued fighting promised only mounting casualties and costs. Negotiations began in Ghent, Belgium, seeking peace terms both nations could accept. The Treaty of Ghent, signed December 24, 1814, essentially restored pre-war territorial boundaries. Neither side gained significant concessions. The issues that had caused the war, British impressment of American sailors, trade restrictions, territorial disputes, were mostly ignored rather than resolved. On paper, the treaty looked like stalemate, acknowledging neither winner nor loser. But psychological reality told a different story. America had fought the British Empire to a draw, proven it could defend itself against the world's dominant military power, established national credibility that would shape international relations for generations. Perry's Lake Erie victory contributed significantly to this perception, demonstrating American capacity for military innovation and battlefield success. The final battle of the war occurred after peace was signed, but before news reached combatants. In January 1815, General Andrew Jackson's forces defeated British regulars at New Orleans in a lopsided victory that killed or wounded over 2,000 British soldiers, while suffering minimal American casualties. The battle had no strategic impact. Peace was already signed, but enormous psychological effect. Americans remembered New Orleans and Lake Erie as proof their military could defeat British professionals, conveniently forgetting the many defeats and disasters that filled the space between. National mythology formed around these victories, creating narrative of American exceptionalism and military prowess that didn't quite match the war's messy reality, but served important purposes in building national identity. Perry's post-war career continued with distinction. In 1816, he commanded a squadron in the Mediterranean, showing the American flag and protecting merchant vessels from piracy. The mission took him to the same waters where he'd served as a young midshipman during the Barbary Wars, closing a circle in his naval career. He visited ports he remembered from his youth, now returning as celebrated commander rather than unknown junior officer. The Mediterranean posting was prestigious, but lacked the intensity of wartime service. Perry performed his duties competently, maintained squadron discipline, conducted diplomatic missions with foreign powers. The work was important, but couldn't compare to the stakes of Lake Erie. By 1819, Perry had been assigned to diplomatic mission to Venezuela, representing American interests as the nation established relations with South American countries gaining independence from Spain. The mission was supposed to be brief: deliver diplomatic correspondence, meet with Venezuelan officials, return to United States. But Venezuela in 1819 was primitive and dangerous, tropical diseases rampant, medical care inadequate. Perry traveled up the Orinoco River into interior regions where yellow fever and malaria killed Europeans with terrifying efficiency. In August 1819, Perry contracted yellow fever. The disease progressed rapidly: high fever, vomiting, jaundice that turned skin yellow and gave the illness its name. There was no effective treatment, just supportive care and hope the patient's constitution could fight off the infection. Perry's constitution, tested in naval combat and frontier hardship, failed him now. He died on August 23, 1819, his 34th birthday, on a ship at sea, far from family and familiar places. The naval hero who'd survived British cannonballs and desperate boat crossings was killed by a mosquito-borne virus. Death's randomness mocking all his accumulated courage and achievement. News of Perry's death reached the United States in October, carried by the same ships that had transported his body back for burial. The nation mourned with genuine grief that transcended political divisions and regional differences. Perry's victory at Lake Erie had become foundational mythology, the kind of story that helped Americans understand what their country could be. His death at 34 seemed particularly tragic. So much potential unfulfilled, so many years of service lost. Memorial services were held in multiple cities. Newspapers published eulogies praising Perry's courage, tactical innovation, and leadership. Congress authorized monuments and honors. Perry's widow Elizabeth, 34 herself, and now responsible for 5 children, became a symbol of military sacrifice. The woman who'd sent her husband to war and received him back only to lose him to disease 6 years later. Elizabeth never remarried. She lived until 1857, another 38 years of widowhood spent raising children, preserving Oliver's memory, fighting battles with historians and biographers who got details wrong or failed to properly credit her husband's achievement. She provided information for official histories, attended commemorations, corrected errors in published accounts. Her children grew up steeped in Lake Erie mythology, expected to honor their father's legacy through their own lives and careers. Several sons entered naval service, continuing the family tradition. One grandson, Matthew Calbraith Perry, would later command the expedition that opened Japan to Western trade in 1854, adding another significant chapter to the Perry family's naval legacy. The question of Lake Erie's historical significance became subject of ongoing debate among historians and military analysts. The immediate military impact was clear: British naval power eliminated, Northwest Territory secured, Native American Confederation destroyed, but broader implications were harder to quantify. Did Perry's victory actually change the War of 1812's outcome? Would Britain have negotiated peace regardless of who controlled Lake Erie? The counterfactuals were impossible to prove, leaving space for historical disagreement that continued long after participants died. What seemed undeniable was the psychological and cultural impact. Perry's victory became emblematic of American determination, innovation, and refusal to accept defeat. The story resonated because it confirmed beliefs Americans wanted to hold about themselves, that they were scrappy underdogs who could defeat powerful established forces through ingenuity and courage. The boat crossing especially captured imagination. That moment when Perry refused to surrender despite his flagship being destroyed, when he grabbed a battle flag and rode through cannonball-churned water seeking another platform from which to continue fighting. The image was perfect, cinematic before cinema existed, the kind of dramatic gesture that transcended tactical necessity and became symbolic of national character. The controversy surrounding Jesse Elliott's performance persisted throughout both men's lifetimes and beyond. Elliott claimed he'd followed Perry's battle plan, engaged his assigned opponent at appropriate range, done everything orders required. Perry's supporters argued Elliott should have adapted to changing circumstances, should have seen Lawrence in trouble, and provided support regardless of what initial orders specified. The debate became personal and bitter, conducted through letters, newspaper articles, official reports, and occasionally face-to-face confrontations that nearly resulted in duels. Perry maintained public silence about Elliott's performance until his death, refusing to officially criticize his second-in-command despite private fury about Niagara's delayed entry into close action. After Perry died, Elliott's defenders became more vocal, arguing their man had been unfairly scapegoated for tactical decisions Perry himself made. Modern historians generally conclude Elliott could have done more to support Lawrence, but wasn't solely responsible for the flagship's near destruction. Perry's battle plan contained flaws, specifically failing to account for wind conditions that might prevent synchronized attack. Elliott's execution of that flawed plan was overly cautious, but not technically insubordinate. Both commanders share some responsibility for the morning's tactical confusion, though Perry's afternoon heroics and ultimate victory somewhat obscured his morning's planning failures. The controversy demonstrates how combat creates ambiguity, how brave men can disagree about proper action in crisis, how victory excuses mistakes that defeat would condemn. For Captain Barclay, Lake Erie meant professional disgrace despite being honorably acquitted at his court-martial. He'd fought with courage against superior numbers. His wounds attested to personal bravery. The court found his actions beyond reproach given circumstances. But defeat was defeat, and Barclay would always be the British captain who lost Lake Erie. He never commanded ships again, his injuries and the battle's outcome effectively ending his active career. He returned to Scotland, married, raised a family, lived quietly until his death in 1837. In his later years, Barclay occasionally wrote about the battle, always with respect for Perry's tactical skill and personal courage. The two commanders never met after their brief conversation in Niagara's sickbay, but Barclay's letters suggest he bore no personal animosity toward the American who defeated him. War was war, and fortune favored the bold that September afternoon. Hannibal Collins mustered out of naval service in 1815 when the war ended, and peace eliminated need for wartime crew expansion. He returned to Philadelphia with prize money from Lake Erie, enough to establish himself in business. He opened a sail-making shop, using skills learned during his naval service, employing other black veterans who struggled finding work in civilian economy. The business prospered modestly, providing Hannibal comfortable living and community standing. He married in 1817, had children, became active in Philadelphia's free black community, told his Lake Erie story to anyone who'd listen. In later years, as abolitionist movement gained strength, Hannibal's service became evidence in arguments for racial equality. Abolitionists pointed to black sailors like Hannibal, who'd fought bravely at Lake Erie, asking why men equal in battle shouldn't be equal in civil society. Hannibal attended veteran gatherings, met other Lake Erie survivors, watched the battle's mythology grow with each retelling. He noticed how his role and the roles of other black sailors often got minimized or erased in popular accounts that focused solely on Perry's heroism. Fighting that erasure became part of Hannibal's later activism, insisting that victory belonged to diverse crews, that black contribution be acknowledged and honored. Hannibal died in the 1850s, exact date uncertain, buried in a Philadelphia cemetery that no longer exists. His children and grandchildren carried his Lake Erie story forward, using it to challenge racist assumptions and demonstrate Black Americans' long history of military service and sacrifice. One great-grandson supposedly attended the Lake Erie Centennial celebration in 1913, an elderly Black man who told anyone listening that his great-grandfather had rode Commodore Perry across the battlefield. The story's veracity is impossible to verify, but it illustrates how Lake Erie victory became woven into family histories and community memories, each retelling adding layers of meaning and significance. The physical monuments to Lake Erie came slowly. A simple marker was erected at Erie, Pennsylvania in 1826, noting the battle's location and Perry's role. Perry's body was moved to Newport, Rhode Island for final burial, his grave marked with appropriate honors. But no major national monument existed for decades. The Civil War intervened, consuming national attention and resources. Not until the early 20th century did serious planning begin for appropriate memorial to commemorate the battle and honor all who fought. The Perry's Victory and International Peace Memorial, completed in 1915, stands 352 feet tall on South Bass Island in Lake Erie near Put-in-Bay, Ohio. The design deliberately emphasizes peace and reconciliation rather than military triumph. Three nations, United States, Britain, and Canada, are honored, acknowledging that former enemies became allies and friends. The memorial's crypt holds remains of 3 American and 3 British officers killed in the battle, united in death as they were separated in life. The monument's very existence speaks to how time transforms memory, how battles that seemed world-defining in their moment become historical curiosities that future generations study with detached interest. Modern visitors to the memorial often struggle understanding why this particular battle matters. The interpretive materials explain strategic significance: control of Great Lakes, Northwest Territory secured, War of 1812 turning point. But the deeper meaning, the reason Americans built a 352-foot column on a small island in Lake Erie, connects to national mythology about determination and innovation. Perry's story resonates because it confirms beliefs about American exceptionalism, about scrappy underdogs defeating powerful establishments, about individual courage mattering more than material advantages. Whether those beliefs reflect historical reality is less important than their cultural power, their ability to shape how Americans understand themselves and their nation's character. The reconstructed USS Niagara, launched in 1988 after years of restoration work, sails Lake Erie as a living monument to the battle. The ship isn't perfectly historically accurate. Modern safety requirements and volunteer crew composition demanded compromises. But she captures the spirit of 1813's original. When Niagara visits port cities around the Great Lakes, thousands of people tour her decks, trying to imagine what combat felt like aboard such vessels. The cramped spaces, the low ceilings, the exposed gun positions, all of it makes clear how brutal naval warfare was in the age of sail. Modern visitors struggle imagining standing on that deck while cannonballs crashed overhead, while men died screaming beside them, while smoke choked their lungs and terror paralyzed their limbs. The Niagara helps bridge historical distance, makes the battle feel slightly more real and immediate than abstract historical text ever could. Educational programs connected to the memorial and the reconstructed Niagara teach Perry's story to new generations. School groups visit, learning about the War of 1812 and Lake Erie's role. The lessons emphasize leadership, tactical innovation, importance of diverse teams working together. Teachers use Perry's boat crossing as example of courage under pressure, the kind of decision-making that separates great leaders from merely competent ones. Whether 13-year-old students fully grasp what Perry risked that afternoon is questionable, but exposure to the story plants seeds that might flower later when those students face their own impossible challenges. The bicentennial commemoration in September 2013 drew international attention, with official representatives from United States, Canada, and Britain attending ceremonies acknowledging the battle's 200th anniversary. Speeches emphasized peace and friendship between nations that once fought. A naval vessel from each country participated, visual reminder that former enemies became allies. The event balanced honoring sacrifice with celebrating reconciliation, difficult tonal management but necessary for international memorial. Veterans from recent conflicts, Iraq, Afghanistan, peacekeeping missions, attended, connecting past and present military service, acknowledging continuity of sacrifice across generations. One moment from the 2013 ceremony captured something essential about historical memory. An elderly Navy veteran, possibly the last surviving person to have spoken directly with a Lake Erie veteran before all original participants died in the 1880s, was interviewed about what the battle meant. His answer cut through ceremonial rhetoric to something more fundamental. His voice carried the weight of accumulated years. Perry showed us that the moment you decide you won't lose is the moment you start winning. Not when you actually win, but when you decide losing isn't an option. That's what "don't give up the ship" really means. The observation distilled Perry's achievement to its essence. Victory at Lake Erie resulted less from superior forces or better tactics than from absolute refusal to accept defeat. When Lawrence was destroyed, Perry had every rational reason to surrender. Instead, he made the irrational, audacious decision to abandon his flagship and continue fighting from another platform. That decision violated naval tradition, defied conventional wisdom, risked his life needlessly from any sensible military perspective. But it worked, and in working, demonstrated that determination and innovative thinking could overcome circumstances that appeared hopeless. Modern military academies still teach Lake Erie as case study in leadership and tactical flexibility. The Naval Academy at Annapolis includes the battling curriculum, focusing on Perry's decision-making under extreme pressure. Business schools use the boat crossing as example of crisis management and risk-taking. Leadership seminars dissect Perry's combination of careful preparation and aggressive execution. The battle transcends its historical moment, becomes parable applicable to any situation requiring courage and innovation against long odds. The darker aspects of Lake Erie's legacy receive less attention in popular memory. The Native American Confederation destroyed, Tecumseh's dreams shattered, tribes forcibly relocated. These consequences follow directly from Perry's victory, but don't fit comfortably into celebratory narrative. Modern historians try balancing triumphant American story with tragic Native American outcome, acknowledging that victory for one group meant catastrophe for another. The effort is necessary but difficult, requiring audiences to hold multiple truths simultaneously. Perry's achievement was remarkable, and it enabled displacement and destruction of Native peoples. Both things can be true, though reconciling them creates cognitive dissonance many prefer avoiding. Similarly, the participation of Black sailors like Hannibal Collins gets acknowledged more now than in earlier eras, but still feels supplementary to main Perry-focused narrative. Modern interpretive materials mention diverse crews, note that 15 to 20% of Perry's sailors were African American, explain that integration proved successful despite contemporary racist assumptions. But the deeper implications, that Black military service predates abolition by decades, that racism was always contradicted by actual evidence of Black capability, that America's failure to grant equality wasn't because Black citizens didn't earn it, remain uncomfortable truths easier to mention than fully explore. Elizabeth Perry's role also deserves greater recognition than it typically receives. She sent her husband to war repeatedly, raised children largely alone, endured anxiety every time Oliver departed for dangerous assignments, then spent 38 years of widowhood preserving his legacy and raising their children. The military spouse sacrifice is real and profound, the price families pay for national security, yet it rarely receives acknowledgement proportional to its weight. Elizabeth's story represents thousands of similar stories, women and families who gave up years of normalcy so men could serve, who bore private costs so the nation could maintain its military. The final accounting of Lake Erie's significance resists simple calculation. Militarily, it was decisive victory that changed the war's strategic balance. Psychologically, it was a transformative moment that shaped American self-perception. Culturally, it became foundational mythology that told Americans who they were and could be. The costs, 258 casualties, Native American displacement, complicated legacies, were real but often subsumed into triumphalist narratives that emphasize glory over grief. Perry himself remains enigmatic figure despite extensive documentation. His official correspondence shows competent, occasionally brilliant naval officer. His personal letters reveal devoted husband and father. His actions demonstrate courage beyond question. But the inner man, what he actually thought and felt in those crucial moments, remains partially obscured by time and deliberate self-presentation. Perry knew he was making history, knew his actions would be scrutinized, shaped his official accounts accordingly. The spontaneous, unguarded Perry who woke, frightened before battle, and wrote those doubts to Elizabeth. That man appears only in fragments, glimpses that humanize the hero without fully explaining him. What endures most powerfully is the image. Perry standing in that boat, battle flags streaming, rowing through cannonball-churned water toward fresh ship and renewed combat. The moment distills something Americans want to believe about themselves. That when circumstances demand everything, when defeat seems certain, when rational calculation says quit, the American response is to grab a flag and keep fighting. Whether that self-conception is accurate or aspirational matters less than its cultural power, its ability to inspire similar determination in future challenges. The legacy Perry left wasn't just military victory or tactical innovation. It was example that refusing surrender, maintaining determination despite overwhelming odds, innovating when conventional wisdom offers no solution, these approaches can succeed. Not always, not guaranteed, but possible in ways that cautious conventional thinking never achieves. Perry's boat crossing was insane by any reasonable standard, yet it worked, and in working, validated every future leader who faced impossible situation and chose audacity over prudence. In the end, Lake Erie mattered because it demonstrated what America could be when led by someone unwilling to accept defeat, when diverse crews worked together towards shared purpose, when innovation overcame material disadvantage. The battle was won in 3 hours, but its meaning took generations to fully unfold. As each retelling added new layers of significance and interpretation. Perry's words, "Don't give up the ship," became shorthand for American determination, applicable far beyond naval combat to any endeavor requiring sustained effort against discouraging odds. The blue battle flag itself, the actual fabric that flew on Lawrence and later Niagara, survives in climate-controlled storage at the Naval Academy Museum. The cloth is fragile now, 2 centuries old, carefully preserved but inevitably deteriorating. Visitors can see it occasionally on special display, that rectangle of blue with white letters spelling out the command that defined Perry's life and legacy. The flag is just fabric, just thread and dye, yet it carries weight beyond its physical mass. It represents a moment when one man decided the rules didn't matter, when tradition could be violated if violation meant victory, when personal risk was acceptable price for achieving the impossible. That flag, that boat crossing, that September afternoon, they became America's story about itself, the narrative that explained how a young nation defeated an empire, how determination trumped experience, how refusing to lose mattered more than any material advantage. Whether the story was completely accurate mattered less than whether it was useful, whether it inspired future Americans to similar courage and innovation. Perry's legacy was teaching that the moment you decide you won't surrender is the moment victory becomes possible, not certain but possible, and possibility is all anyone needs who has the courage to reach for it.